London, September 1979. The Dorchester Hotel's penthouse suite was filled with cigar smoke and nervous energy. Michael Caine sat across from Harvey Goldstein, one of Hollywood's most powerful producers, discussing what should have been a routine contract negotiation for the island, Peter Benchley's follow-up to Jaws. But nothing about this meeting would be routine because Goldstein had just made the biggest mistake of his career. "Look, Michael," Goldstein said, leaning back in his leather chair with the confidence of a man who owned half of Beverly Hills. "Let's cut through the bullshit. You need this film more than we need you. Your last 3 pictures underperformed. California Suite was a disaster. Beyond the Poseidon Adventure was worse. You're damaged goods right now." Caine's agent, Dennis Selinger, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This wasn't how these meetings usually went. Producers might think these things, but they didn't usually say them so bluntly. "What Harvey's trying to say," Selinger began. "What I'm saying," Goldstein interrupted, "is that we're offering Caine a lifeline here. $600,000 for 12 weeks' work. That's generous considering his recent box office performance." Caine had remained silent through most of the meeting, sipping his tea and watching Goldstein perform. He'd dealt with powerful producers before, but this one was different. Goldstein wasn't just arrogant. He was cruel. He enjoyed the power he held over actors' careers, enjoyed making them squirm. "Harvey," Caine said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Shoot. What do you think I'm worth?" Goldstein laughed, a harsh sound that filled the suite. "Right now, 600,000. Maybe less if you're difficult about it." "I meant as a human being." The laughter stopped. Goldstein's expression shifted from amusement to confusion. "What? As a human being? What do you think I'm worth?" Goldstein looked at Selinger as if to say, "Is your client having a breakdown?" "Michael," Selinger said carefully, "maybe we should." "I'm serious," Caine continued, his voice still calm. "Harvey, you've spent the last hour telling me I'm damaged goods, that my recent films were disasters, that I should be grateful for whatever scraps you're willing to throw me. So I'm curious. Do you think that makes me worthless as a person?" Goldstein was getting irritated now. He didn't like philosophical discussions. He liked simple transactions, money for services, power for compliance. "Look, Caine, I don't know what game you're playing." "No game," Caine said. "Just trying to understand your perspective, because the way you've been talking, it sounds like you think an actor's worth as a human being is directly tied to their last box office performance." "In this business it is," Goldstein said bluntly. "You're only as good as your last picture. Everyone knows that." Caine set down his teacup and leaned forward. Something in his posture changed. The casual, almost deferential manner he'd maintained throughout the meeting was gone, replaced by something harder. "Harvey, let me tell you a story." "I don't have time for stories." "You'll make time for this one." The suite went completely quiet. Even the traffic noise from Park Lane seemed to fade. 3 years ago," Caine began, "I was filming The Eagle Has Landed in a small village in Norfolk. Beautiful place. Very rural, very peaceful. One evening after we wrapped for the day, I was walking back to my hotel when I heard screaming coming from a cottage." Goldstein glanced at his watch, but Caine ignored him. "I ran toward the sound and found a house on fire. Small place, thatched roof, the kind that goes up like a matchbox. There was a woman outside, hysterical, screaming that her daughter was trapped inside. The room was absolutely still now. Even Goldstein had stopped fidgeting. The fire brigade hadn't arrived yet. Wouldn't arrive for another 20 minutes. This little girl, maybe 8 years old, was trapped in an upstairs bedroom, and the stairs were already engulfed in flames." Caine paused, looking directly at Goldstein. "Now, Harvey, according to your logic, my worth at that moment should have been determined by my box office performance, right? The Eagle Has Landed hadn't been released yet, so we didn't know if it would be successful. My previous film had been only moderately profitable, so by your standards I was what? Moderately valuable? Somewhat worthwhile?" Goldstein opened his mouth to speak, but Caine held up a hand. "I climbed through a ground floor window into that burning house. The smoke was so thick I could barely see, the heat so intense it felt like it was melting my skin. I found the stairs, or what was left of them. Half the steps were gone, the banister was on fire, but I climbed up anyway. The image was so vivid, so immediate that everyone in the room could picture it. Found the little girl in her bedroom, unconscious from smoke inhalation. She couldn't have weighed more than 60 pounds. But carrying her down those burning stairs while I could barely breathe, barely see, it was the hardest thing I'd ever done. Caine's voice was quiet, matter of fact, but the power of the story filled the room. We both made it out. She spent a week in hospital but recovered completely. I had some burns on my hands and arms. Nothing serious. The whole thing probably took 10 minutes from start to finish. He looked at Goldstein again. Now during those 10 minutes was my worth as a human being determined by my box office receipts. When that mother saw me carrying her daughter out of that burning house, do you think she gave a damn whether my last film had made money? Goldstein was staring at him now. All pretense of boredom gone. The point I'm making, Harvey, is that there are different ways to measure worth. Box office is one way. But it's not the only way. It's not even the most important way. Caine stood up and walked to the window overlooking Hyde Park. I've been acting for 25 years. I've made some good films and some terrible ones. I've had hits and flops, successes and disasters, but I've never let my career define my worth as a person, and I've never let people like you convince me that it should. He turned back to face Goldstein. You sit in this suite, in your expensive suits, smoking your expensive cigars, and you think that gives you the right to tell actors what they're worth. You think money equals value, power equals importance. But you're wrong. Goldstein's face was turning red. Now wait just a minute. I'm not finished, Caine said, his voice cutting through Goldstein's protest like a blade. You want to know what you're worth, Harvey? Not as a producer, not as a businessman, but as a human being. The question hung in the air like a challenge. You're worth exactly the same as that little girl I carried out of the burning house. Exactly the same as her mother. Exactly the same as the firefighters who arrived later. Exactly the same as me. Because human worth isn't determined by bank accounts or box office receipts or how many people have to kiss your ass to get a job. Goldstein was on his feet now. His face flushed with anger. How dare you? How dare I what? Caine interrupted. How dare I remind you that you're a human being first and a producer second? How dare I suggest that treating people with basic dignity might be more important than your quarterly profits? The confrontation had attracted attention. Goldstein's assistant had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. A few other people from his entourage were hovering nearby, unsure whether to intervene. You think you're teaching me a lesson? Goldstein snarled. You think your little story about playing hero makes you better than me? I think, Caine said quietly, that you've forgotten something fundamental about this business. We're not making widgets in a factory. We're not selling insurance or manipulating stock prices. We're telling stories about human beings. And if you don't understand the value of human beings, you have no business telling those stories. He walked back to his chair and sat down calmly. Every film you produce, every story you choose to tell sends a message about what you think matters in the world. And right now the message you're sending is that people are only valuable if they're profitable. That's not just bad business philosophy, Harvey. That's bad humanity. Selinger was watching this exchange with fascination and terror. He'd never seen an actor speak to a major producer this way. Careers had been destroyed for much less. But Caine wasn't finished. You mentioned my recent films. You called them disasters. Let me tell you about one of those disasters. California Suite. You're right. It didn't make much money. But do you know what it did do? Goldstein didn't answer. It employed 300 people for 4 months. Cameramen, sound technicians, costume designers, makeup artists, drivers, caterers. 300 families had steady income because of that disaster. 300 people could pay their mortgages, feed their children, send them to school. Caine's voice was gaining intensity. And the film itself? It told stories about marriage, about compromise, about the small moments of connection and disconnection that define relationships. Maybe it wasn't a blockbuster, but it meant something to the people who saw it. I got letters from couples who said it helped them understand their own relationships better. He looked directly at Goldstein. So when you call it a disaster, you're not just dismissing my work. You're dismissing the value of all those people's livelihoods. You're dismissing the stories that meant something to audiences. You're reducing everything to a number on a balance sheet." The suite had gone completely quiet again. Goldstein's assistant and the other observers were transfixed. "That's what's wrong with this business," Caine continued. "People like you have forgotten that we're in the business of human stories, not just money. You've forgotten that every decision you make affects real people's lives. You've forgotten that worth isn't just measured in dollars." Goldstein sat down heavily in his chair. Some of the bluster had gone out of him. "Look," he said, his voice less aggressive now, "this is a business. I have investors, shareholders, people I answer to. I can't make decisions based on sentiment." "I'm not asking you to," Caine replied. "I'm asking you to make decisions based on respect. Respect for the people you work with, respect for the stories you tell, respect for the audiences who trust you with their time and money." He leaned forward. "When you brought me here today, you didn't offer me a role. You offered me charity. You made it clear that you thought I should be grateful for whatever scraps you were willing to give me. That's not how you treat someone you respect." Goldstein was quiet for a long moment, processing this. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want you to understand that my worth isn't determined by my last box office performance. I want you to approach this negotiation as a conversation between equals, not as a powerful man bestowing favors on a desperate actor." Caine stood up again. "And I want you to understand that if you can't do that, if you can't see past the numbers to the human beings involved in this process, then maybe you shouldn't be in this business at all." The challenge was clear. Goldstein could continue as he'd been going, treating actors as commodities, reducing everything to profit and loss. Or he could acknowledge that there was more at stake than money. For several seconds nobody moved. The tension in the room was palpable. This was the moment that would determine not just this negotiation, but the relationship between these two men going forward. Finally Goldstein spoke. "You're right." The words were so quiet that everyone in the room leaned forward to make sure they'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry," Goldstein continued, his voice stronger now. "You're absolutely right. I've been treating this as a transaction instead of a collaboration. I've been so focused on the business side that I forgot about the human side." Caine said nothing, waiting. "The truth is," Goldstein said, "I brought you here because I want you for this role. Not because I'm doing you a favor, but because you're the right actor for the part. Your recent films may not have been huge hits, but your performances were solid. You bring something to every role that makes it better." He stood up and walked to the window where Caine had been standing. "I've been in this business for 15 years, and I've made a lot of money. But somewhere along the way, I think I lost sight of why I got into it in the first place. I wanted to tell stories. I wanted to make films that mattered." He turned back to face Caine. "You reminded me today that the stories we tell are about people, real people with real lives and real value that has nothing to do with how much money they make or how much power they have." The change in Goldstein was remarkable. The arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. "I'd like to start this negotiation over," he said. "If you're willing." Caine studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'm willing." Over the next hour they worked out the details of Caine's contract for the island. But the discussion was different now. Instead of Goldstein dictating terms, they collaborated. They talked about the character, about the story they wanted to tell, about how to make the film as good as possible. The financial terms they eventually agreed on were better than Goldstein's original offer, but that wasn't the real victory. The real victory was that they'd found a way to work together based on mutual respect rather than power dynamics. As the meeting concluded, Goldstein walked Caine to the door. "Michael," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. That story about the fire, about the little girl, did that really happen?" Caine smiled. "Every word of it." "What was her name?" "The little girl?" "Emma. Emma Patterson. She's 16 now, wants to be a teacher. I still get Christmas cards from her family." Goldstein nodded slowly. "I'm glad you told me that story. I needed to hear it." "We all need reminding sometimes," Caine said, "about what really matters." Over the following years, Harvey Goldstein's approach to business changed dramatically. He became known for treating actors and crew members with respect, for focusing on the quality of stories rather than just their commercial potential. He credited his conversation with Michael Caine as a turning point in his career and his life. The island itself wasn't a huge success, but it was a solid film that told its story well. More importantly, it was made by a team of people who respected each other and were committed to doing their best work. Years later, when Goldstein was honored by the Producers Guild for his humanitarian efforts in the industry, he told the story of his meeting with Michael Caine. "Michael taught me that day that we're not just in the entertainment business," Goldstein said. "We're in the human business. Every decision we make affects real people's lives, and we have a responsibility to remember that." He paused, looking out at the audience of industry professionals. Success in this business isn't just about box office receipts or profit margins. It's about treating people with dignity, telling stories that matter, and remembering that everyone in this room, from the biggest star to the newest intern, has value that can't be measured in dollars. When Michael Caine was knighted in 2000, Harvey Goldstein was among the first to send congratulations. His note was simple: "For a man who understands that true worth has nothing to do with box office receipts, well deserved." But the impact of that September afternoon in 1979 extended far beyond just two men in a hotel suite. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through Hollywood's tight-knit community. Agents began telling the story to their clients. Directors shared it over dinner parties. Within months it had become industry legend. The story resonated because it articulated something that many people in the entertainment business felt but couldn't express: the constant pressure to justify their worth through numbers, through success metrics that often had little to do with the quality of their work or their value as human beings. Young actors in particular found inspiration in Caine's stand against Goldstein. Here was one of Britain's most respected performers refusing to be diminished by a powerful producer's cruel assessment. It gave them permission to maintain their dignity even when facing rejection or criticism. Sarah Mitchell, a struggling actress who heard the story from her agent in 1980, later said, "I was about to give up acting after a particularly brutal meeting with a studio executive who told me I was too ordinary for leading roles. But hearing about Michael Caine's confrontation with Goldstein reminded me that my worth as a person isn't determined by what some executive thinks of my commercial viability." The story also began to influence how business was conducted in Hollywood. Producers who had heard the tale found themselves thinking twice before dismissing actors or crew members based purely on recent performance metrics. The phrase "remember the Goldstein meeting" became a shorthand way of reminding powerful people to treat others with basic respect. Dennis Selinger, Caine's agent, noticed the change almost immediately. Meetings became more civil, he recalled years later. Producers were still tough negotiators, but they stopped being gratuitously cruel. Nobody wanted to be the next Harvey Goldstein. The transformation in Goldstein himself was equally remarkable to witness. Colleagues who had known him for years were stunned by the change in his approach to business. Where he had once been notoriously difficult and demanding, he became collaborative and respectful. "Harvey became a different person after that meeting," said Janet Cohen, a longtime assistant who worked with him throughout the 1980s. "He started asking people how they were doing, not just what their last project grossed. He remembered birthdays, family events. He became genuinely interested in the people he worked with as human beings." This change wasn't without its business benefits. Goldstein found that treating people with respect actually improved his film's quality. Actors gave better performances when they felt valued. Crew members worked harder when they felt appreciated. The collaborative atmosphere on his sets became legendary in an industry known for its dysfunction. His 1982 film The Verdict became a critical and commercial success, largely because of the respectful collaborative environment Goldstein created. Paul Newman, who starred in the film, specifically credited the producer's approach with helping him deliver one of his finest performances. "Harvey created an atmosphere where everyone felt safe to take risks," Newman said at the time. "He treated everyone from the lead actors to the craft services team with the same level of respect. That kind of environment brings out the best in people." The financial success of The Verdict proved that Goldstein's new approach wasn't just morally superior, it was also commercially viable. Studios began to take notice of his methods, and other producers started adopting similar approaches. By 1985, Goldstein had become one of Hollywood's most sought-after producers, not just because of his commercial success, but because of his reputation for treating people well. A-list actors began specifically requesting to work with him, knowing they would be treated with dignity, regardless of their recent box office performance. The ripple effects of that 1979 confrontation continued to spread throughout the industry. Film schools began incorporating discussions about professional ethics and human dignity into their curricula. Industry organizations started developing codes of conduct that emphasized respect and professionalism. In 1987, the Producers Guild established the Harvey Goldstein Award for Professional Excellence in Humanity, recognizing producers who combined commercial success with exceptional treatment of cast and crew. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. An award named after a man whose transformation had been sparked by his own failure to treat someone with basic respect. When Goldstein accepted the first award bearing his name, he was visibly emotional. "This award represents the most important lesson of my career," he said, "that success without humanity is meaningless, that power without compassion is destructive, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can receive is having someone care enough to tell you when you're wrong." He looked out at the audience of industry professionals. "Michael Caine didn't just refuse to accept my disrespect that day. He held up a mirror and forced me to see what I had become. He reminded me that everyone in this room, regardless of their position or their recent projects, deserves to be treated with dignity." The speech received a 5-minute standing ovation, but for Goldstein, the real reward came later that evening when Michael Caine approached him at the after-party. "I'm proud of you, Harvey," Caine said simply. "You took a difficult lesson and turned it into something positive. That takes real character." "I had a good teacher," Goldstein replied. They talked for nearly an hour that night, not about business or projects, but about life, about growth, about the responsibility that comes with power and success. It was the beginning of a friendship that lasted until Goldstein's death in 1998. The meeting at the Dorchester had also marked a turning point in Caine's own career, not because of any immediate commercial success, but because it clarified his own values and priorities. He became known throughout the industry for his professionalism and his refusal to tolerate disrespectful treatment of anyone on his sets. Young actors often sought his advice, and he would frequently tell them the story of his confrontation with Goldstein, emphasizing the importance of maintaining their dignity even in difficult situations. "Never let anyone make you feel worthless because of your recent failures," he would tell them. "Your value as a human being isn't determined by your last role or your box office numbers. Remember that. And make sure the people you work with remember it too." This philosophy influenced every aspect of Caine's career. He chose projects based not just on their commercial potential, but on whether he could work with people who shared his values. He walked away from lucrative opportunities when producers or directors showed a pattern of disrespectful behavior. "Life's too short to work with assholes," he once told a journalist. "There are plenty of good people in this business who know how to treat others with respect. I'd rather work with them for less money than compromise my principles for a bigger paycheck." This approach served him well. Throughout the 1980s and beyond, Caine built a reputation as one of the most professional and respected actors in the industry. Directors loved working with him not just because of his talent, but because of his attitude and his influence on the overall atmosphere of their productions. When The Island was finally released in 1980, it received mixed reviews and modest box office success. But for those who knew the story behind its production, the film represented something more significant, proof that movies could be made with both commercial ambition and human respect. The cast and crew of The Island remained close long after filming ended, unusual in an industry where people often work intensely together for a few months and then never see each other again. They credited the respectful, collaborative atmosphere established by both Caine and the transformed Goldstein with creating bonds that lasted for decades. As the years passed, the story of the Dorchester meeting became more than just Hollywood gossip. It became a parable about the importance of treating people with dignity, regardless of their position or recent performance. Business schools began using it as a case study in ethical leadership. Management consultants cited it as an example of how changing your approach to people can transform your entire organization. The lesson resonated far beyond the entertainment industry. Corporate executives, sports coaches, political leaders, people in positions of power across all sectors found relevance in the story of how one man's reminder about human dignity had transformed another man's entire approach to leadership. Michael Caine himself remained characteristically modest about the incident's broader impact. When asked about it in interviews, he would typically deflect attention from his own role and focus on Goldstein's courage in changing his approach. Harvey deserves the credit, Caine would say. I just told him a story. He's the one who had the character to listen, to change, to become a better person. That's not easy for anyone, especially someone who's been successful doing things a certain way for years. But those who witnessed that September afternoon in 1979 knew better. They had seen Caine's quiet courage in standing up to one of Hollywood's most powerful figures. They had watched him articulate principles that many people felt but few had the strength to express when their careers were on the line. If you've ever been made to feel that your worth is tied to your latest success or failure, if you've ever encountered someone who mistakes power for value, Michael Caine's response to Harvey Goldstein reminds us that human dignity isn't negotiable. That respect isn't something to be earned through achievement, but something every person deserves simply by virtue of being human. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is remind someone of their own humanity, and in doing so rediscover the best parts of your own. And sometimes, just sometimes, that reminder can change not just one person, but an entire industry's approach to treating people with the respect and dignity every human being deserves.